In early October 2024, a small Russian tugboat named Nika departed from the port of Nakhodka in Russia's Far East. The vessel was modest, approximately 15 meters long, designed for coastal towing operations rather than open ocean voyages. On board were 3 men: Mikhail Pichugin, 52 years old, the captain and most experienced sailor of the group, and 2 younger crewmates whose names have been withheld from public reports at the request of their families. The Nika was being transferred to a new work location along the Russian Pacific coast. It was supposed to be a routine journey, hugging the coastline, staying within reach of ports and rescue services. The weather forecast was acceptable. The vessel was fueled and provisioned for a short coastal voyage. There was no indication that anything would go wrong. But the sea does not care about expectations. Somewhere in the Sea of Okhotsk, the Nika's engine failed. The crew attempted repairs but could not restore power. They radioed for assistance, but their position was remote, and before help could arrive, a storm swept in from the north. The small tugboat was pushed away from the coast, driven eastward into the open Pacific Ocean. Within days, they had drifted beyond the range of their radio. They were alone on the largest ocean on Earth. The first weeks adrift were consumed by desperate attempts to restore power or signal for help. The crew worked on the engine constantly, trying every repair they could manage with limited tools and parts. Nothing worked. The damage was beyond their ability to fix. They rationed their supplies carefully, but the Nika had been provisioned for a short coastal journey, not a long-term survival situation. Food began to run low within the first 2 weeks. Fresh water became their most critical concern. They had some containers of drinking water aboard, but not nearly enough for 3 men facing an indefinite drift across the Pacific. When rain came, they collected it in every container they could find, funneling it from tarps and canvas into bottles and buckets. When rain did not come, they suffered. The Pacific can go weeks without significant precipitation. The men learned to recognize the clouds that might bring water and to despair at the clear skies that brought only sun and thirst. They had fishing equipment aboard, a small blessing. They began catching whatever they could, small fish, the occasional larger catch. They ate the fish raw to conserve fuel for what little cooking capability they had, saving the heat for boiling water when they could catch rain. The diet was meager and monotonous, but it kept them alive. Barely. As the weeks stretched into months, the physical and psychological toll mounted. The 3 men grew weaker. Their bodies consumed themselves, burning fat and then muscle as the inadequate diet failed to meet their caloric needs. Their clothing hung loose on shrinking frames. Their faces became gaunt, their eyes hollow. The cold was relentless. The Pacific in autumn and winter is not the tropical paradise of popular imagination. At the latitudes where the Nika drifted, temperatures dropped to near freezing. Wind cut through their clothing. Rain soaked them to the bone. The small tugboat offered limited shelter, and heating was impossible without fuel. They huddled together for warmth, wrapped in whatever they could find, waiting for the sun to provide brief relief before the night brought cold again. The psychological strain was equally brutal. The endless gray horizon offered no hope. Days passed without seeing another vessel, without any sign that the world beyond the water still existed. They talked less as time went on, conserving energy, retreating into their own thoughts. Despair settled over the Nika like a fog. The 2 younger crewmates began to weaken faster than their captain. Whether from illness, injury sustained during the storm, or simply the cumulative toll of starvation and exposure, their bodies began to fail. The first of Mikhail Pichugin's crewmates died sometime in December 2024. The exact date is unknown. By that point, the men had lost all sense of calendar time. They knew only the rhythm of day and night, storm and calm, hunger and thirst. The death was quiet. The man had been weakening for days, eating less, moving less, slipping into a state of passive acceptance. One morning, he did not wake up. Pichugin and his remaining companion wrapped the body as best they could and committed it to the sea. There was nothing else they could do. No word seemed adequate. They said a simple prayer and watched the body disappear into the gray water. The second crewmate died approximately 3 weeks later. He had held on longer, but the cumulative effects of starvation, dehydration, and exposure were too much. His body simply gave out. Pichugin performed the same grim ritual, wrapping the body and lowering it into the Pacific. Now he was alone. Mikhail Pichugin, 52 years old, drifting somewhere in the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean with no engine, no radio, no food beyond what he could catch, and no idea if anyone was looking for him. He had been at sea for nearly 3 months. He had watched 2 men die. He had no reason to believe he would survive. But he refused to give up. Alone on the Nika, Mikhail Pichugin settled into a routine of survival. He fished every day, lowering lines over the side and waiting for hours in the cold. Some days he caught nothing. Some days he caught enough to sustain himself for another 24 hours. He ate the fish raw, cutting them open with a knife and consuming everything edible, including the organs and the eyes. The protein kept him alive, but it was not enough to maintain his body weight. He continued to waste away, his muscles shrinking, his bones becoming visible beneath his skin. Water remained his greatest challenge. He had perfected his rainwater collection system, using every available surface to funnel precipitation into containers. But the Pacific could be cruel. Weeks would pass with barely a drop of rain, and Pichugin would ration his remaining water to a few sips per day, just enough to stay conscious. During those dry periods, he would grow weak and disoriented, his thoughts becoming foggy, his movements slow and clumsy. Then the rain would come, and he would drink deeply, feeling life return to his dehydrated cells. The days blurred together. He stopped trying to count them. He knew only that he was alive, that the boat was still floating, and that as long as those 2 things remained true, there was hope. The psychological toll of isolation was as dangerous as the physical deprivation. Mikhail Pichugin was utterly alone, drifting across the empty Pacific with no human contact, no voice to hear, no face to see. The silence was profound, broken only by the wind, the waves, and the creaking of the tugboat's hull. He began talking to himself to maintain his sanity. He narrated his actions. He recited prayers. He spoke to the ghosts of his dead crewmates, asking for their guidance, telling them he would not give up. He thought constantly about his family back in Russia. He had a wife, children, people waiting for him, not knowing if he was alive or dead. The thought of seeing them again became his primary motivation. When despair threatened to overwhelm him, he would picture their faces and force himself to continue. He maintained small routines to give structure to his days. He would check the boat each morning, ensuring it was still seaworthy. He would fish at the same times. He would clean himself as best he could with seawater. These rituals were not logical necessities, they were psychological anchors, ways of imposing order on a situation that was entirely beyond his control. Without them, he knew, he would lose his mind. And losing his mind would mean losing his life. By February 2025, Mikhail Pichugin had been adrift for over 4 months. The Nika had traveled thousands of miles across the Pacific, carried by currents and winds in a long, slow arc that had brought it back toward Russian waters. Pichugin had no way of knowing this. He had no charts, no GPS, no means of determining his position. He knew only that the water temperature had changed, that the air felt different, that the clouds seemed to form different patterns. These were subtle signs, the kind only a lifetime sailor would notice. They gave him a faint, irrational hope that he might be approaching land. On the morning of February 14th, that hope became reality. A Russian fishing vessel named the Angel spotted an unusual object on the radar and altered course to investigate. What they found was the battered hulk of a small tugboat, drifting low in the water, looking abandoned. They pulled alongside and called out. There was no response. The crew prepared to board what they assumed was a derelict vessel, possibly with bodies aboard. Then a figure appeared on deck. A skeletal man with a wild gray beard and hollow eyes, barely able to stand, raised a hand in greeting. He was alive. Barely alive, but alive. The crew of the Angel immediately launched a rescue operation. They boarded the Nika and found Mikhail Pichugin in critical condition. He was severely emaciated, having lost nearly half his body weight. He was dehydrated, hypothermic, and barely coherent. He could not walk without assistance. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His eyes were sunken deep into his skull. He looked like a man who had returned from the dead. The rescuers wrapped him in blankets and carefully transferred him to their vessel. They gave him small amounts of water and broth, knowing that too much food too quickly could kill a starving man. They radioed ahead to authorities, reporting the impossible. They had found a survivor from a tugboat that had been missing for over 4 months. The Angel altered course for the nearest port, racing to get Pichugin to proper medical care. During the journey, he drifted in and out of consciousness. When he was lucid, he told the crew what had happened. The engine failure. The storm. The long drift. The deaths of his 2 companions. The endless days of fishing and collecting rainwater. The crew listened in stunned silence. They were experienced sailors who understood the sea's cruelty. But what this man had endured was beyond anything they had ever heard. Mikhail Pichugin was taken to a hospital in Magadan, a city on the Russian Pacific coast. He was in critical condition upon arrival, suffering from severe malnutrition, dehydration, and the lingering effects of prolonged exposure. Doctors placed him in intensive care and began the delicate process of rebuilding his body. He was fed intravenously at first, then gradually introduced to solid foods as his digestive system recovered. His weight slowly increased. His vital signs stabilized. Against all medical expectations, he began to recover. The news of his rescue spread quickly. Russian media reported the story extensively. A sailor had survived alone for over 4 months on the Pacific Ocean, watching 2 crewmates die, eating raw fish and drinking rainwater, drifting thousands of miles before being found alive. It seemed almost impossible. Medical experts commented on the extreme rarity of such survival. Maritime authorities launched an investigation into the initial emergency and the failure to locate the vessel earlier. But for Mikhail Pichugin, those questions were secondary. What mattered was that he was alive. He had promised himself he would see his family again. He had made that promise in the darkest moments on the Nika, when death seemed certain. Now he would keep it. Mikhail Pichugin spent several weeks in the hospital before being released. His body had recovered enough to function normally, though the effects of his ordeal would linger for months. He had lost nearly 50 kilograms during his 4 months adrift. His muscles had atrophied. His digestive system remained sensitive. But he was alive, and he was finally going home. The reunion with his family was private, kept away from the media attention that had surrounded his rescue. After more than 4 months of believing he was dead, his wife and children embraced a man who had returned from the sea against all odds. There were tears. There were prayers of thanksgiving. There were no words adequate to express what that moment meant. In the weeks that followed, Pichugin gave interviews about his ordeal. He spoke of the engine failure, the storm, the deaths of his crewmates. He spoke of the loneliness, the hunger, the despair that had threatened to overwhelm him. But he also spoke of what had kept him alive, his faith, his routines, his refusal to surrender, and above all, his determination to see his family again. The sea had taken everything from him except his life. He had held on to that with a grip that never loosened. Mikhail Pichugin survived 133 days adrift on the Pacific Ocean. It remains one of the longest recorded survival drifts in modern maritime history. The Nika was eventually towed to port, a battered shell of a vessel that had somehow carried one man through an impossible journey. Pichugin never went to sea again. He had given the ocean enough. Now it was time to live on land.